Distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure to welcome you today at the European House. The topic of today's discussion is, I would say, very intriguing, very interesting, and a lot of people's attention is drawn to exactly this topic. It's my great pleasure that Ambassador Kohli and our former ambassador in Latvia, Mr. Bond, kindly agreed to participate in the discussion, and it's very promising. And thank you also to Professor Ozoliņa for her kind agreement to moderate the panel. I have to apologize that one of our panelists, Understate Secretary of Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Stiprais, is still on its way. I hope that he will join us, but unfortunately we have to start in his absence. So, without talking too much, I will pass the floor to Jean.
Thank you very much. I probably will use that microphone. It will be slightly easier. I will probably start with a few sentences in Latvian since our discussion is broadcasted. Cienījamie diskusijas dalībnieki.
Hello, dear participants of the discussion. Today we are going to
Ļoti vienai no svarīgām tēmām, kas ir saistīta ar Lielbritānijas izziņoto referendumu par palikšanu vai izstāšanos no Eiropas Savienības, un nenoliedzami tas ir kļuvis par vienu no centrāliem jautājumiem Eiropas Savienības darba kārtībā, un mums šodien ir ļoti pieredzējuši un ļoti interesanti runātāji. Tā ir Lielbritānijas vēstniece Sāra Kohli, bijušais Lielbritānijas vēstnieks Latvijā Jānis Bonds, pieredzējušais ārlietu eksperts un arī mūsu parlamenta deputāts Atis Lēņš, un mēs gaidām ierodamies arī Eduardu Stipro no ārlietu ministrijas. So now we can turn our eyes and thoughts to discussion on the topic of today. So we will proceed in the following manner, that I will invite speakers one by one to present their views on the referendum issue and its impact on EU, but also UK's future, and most probably also to international affairs at large. So I welcome Edward Tiešraide. Thank you for joining us. So, but you will have time to relax, so you will be the last in the row, so enough time to take a breath and have a glass of water. So I would like asking question to British Ambassador in Latvia, Sara Kohli. Could you please give us the reasoning behind British decision to have a referendum? Because if we look at what's happening these days in the European Union and in our environment, I should admit that UK is a very brave country. I can't imagine another country to do something so brave as you decided to do. And I would like to recall one of very short sayings of Carl Bildt when he was here in Riga conference. And then he said that actually the biggest threat to the European Union is not Daesh or Russia, but it is Brexit. So would you agree with that one? So please give your picture on what's happening.
Thank you very much, Anita. Good afternoon, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to see you all here this afternoon. I certainly will answer your question on why a referendum now. I was planning to set the scene to talk about three key areas. Firstly, where we are now in the negotiation process. And then to talk briefly about the four areas of reform. I'm sure you all know what they are, but to sort of address some of the questions I'm asked most frequently in each of those areas, and then give you a bit of a sense as to what the latest mood is in the UK and where the UK public is on a referendum. So why a referendum now? I am asked that, and asked, given all the issues that the European Union is grappling with, why add the UK question on top of an already full agenda? And the answer to that is, this isn't something that the UK has suddenly conjured up in the last couple of months. This isn't something new. It's been a very long process. Prime Minister Cameron first set out his ideas for reform of the European Union in his speech at Bloomberg back in January 2013. So 2 years ago, when he first set the ideas out, we were in the European Union in a different place. And that negotiation was then reinvigorated when he won the general election in the UK in May of this year as a majority Conservative government, and set out in his manifesto his ideas for reform of the European Union. And there's been a very intensive process of consultation with member states since then, as I'm sure many of you are aware. And he recognises, and recognised from the outset, that this was going to be a difficult process and a difficult negotiation. And so it has proved, as many negotiations are. But I want to underline that this has been a negotiation. Some people portray this as the UK stating its demands and saying to the European Union, take it or leave it. That's not what's been happening. It has been and still is an ongoing negotiation between the UK and all members of the European Union. And throughout the process, the UK has taken on board the concerns of member states, many ideas from member states, and amended what the UK is asking for accordingly. So the letter that Prime Minister Cameron sent to European leaders in November was very clear in setting out the results that the UK would like to achieve, but not dictating how we get there. And he specifically said he was very keen to hear from others their ideas about how we get there. In terms of the consultations and discussions that have been happening with Latvia, Prime Minister Cameron met your Prime Minister Straujuma here in Riga in May, and they had intensive discussions. And those discussions have continued over the previous 6 months, various meetings here, in other European capitals, a lot in Brussels, with the UK Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, Chancellor, and our Minister for Europe. Prime Minister Cameron met Strayuma again at the end of October, and most recently Foreign Minister Rinkiewicz met our Europe Minister in London just 2 weeks ago, and they obviously discussed the UK renegotiation. And following the letter from Prime Minister Cameron to EU leaders in early November, there's been even more intensive discussions between officials. So representatives from the Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs were in Brussels about 3 weeks ago, having very intensive technical talks, as all member states have been doing with the Council Secretariat and also with the UK ambassador to the EU. And those continue. And of course, just on Monday this week, President Tusk has written to all members of the Council, updating them on progress. His assessment is that the talks have made good progress, but more time is needed to agree the final form of the deal. And so, in particular, there needs to be a further political discussion on the social benefits and welfare question. So President Tusk and Prime Minister Cameron have agreed that they will have a very political, detailed discussion at the December European Council between leaders with a view to preparing a concrete proposal to be adopted in February. So that's where we are as of now on the process. Of course, we're 8 days out now from the December European Council, which will be very, very important discussions on the renegotiation. So, second area, what are we actually talking about renegotiating? As I'm sure you're familiar, there's 4 broad areas. They are sovereignty, economic governance, competitiveness, and welfare reform. So, I said I'd sort of address some of the questions I'm frequently asked under each of these, that people seem to not really understand where we're coming from. And on sovereignty, the question I'm often asked is, why do you care about the wording of ever closer union? Why is that so important for the UK? Given that there is an acceptance within the European Union that there are different paths of integration for different member states. So why is the UK making such a big deal about ever closer union? And the reason is that it isn't just words. Those words really do mean something. And we've seen this in the recent rulings of the European Court of Justice. They've actually taken those words, ever closer union, and used those to make legal judgment. They've made an interpretation based on the spirit of the treaties. So ever closer union has actually had a legal impact on decisions affecting the UK. That's why it really matters to the UK. On national parliaments, I'm asked, why do you want to change the system? There's already provision under the treaties for national parliaments to have more power. And the answer to that is the UK doesn't think the current system's working, as devised under the Lisbon Treaty. Since the system was devised, yellow cards have only been used twice. And I think Mr. Lenich would agree with me, that's not because national parliaments are always happy with the decisions coming from Brussels, but because the system's actually too restrictive, and often the timescales are too short for national parliaments to be able to go through their processes and present the Commission with the yellow card. So Latvia did some great work on this during their EU presidency through the COSAC meetings, but we think that the system needs to be reformed, so when a number of national parliaments have concerns about initiatives coming from the Commission, that they can collectively speak up against them and their voice can be heard. On competitiveness, I think this is the area where there's most consensus. Again, Latvia did some really good work during the EU presidency in moving the competitiveness agenda forward, and the Commission itself has done some very good work on competitiveness. But the UK wants to ensure that we make that drive towards competitiveness as strong as we can, and we go further faster, particularly on reducing the regulatory burdens on businesses. Greater competitiveness is in the interests of all member states to allow European Union to compete on a global scale. When it comes to economic governance, this is really about how decisions are made between those countries within the Eurozone and those outside of the Eurozone. And again, the UK is not trying to restrict the cooperation, the integration of those countries within the Eurozone. We fully accept that there needs to be very strong cooperation between those member states and more integration. But our concern is to make sure that the decision-making between the Eurozone countries does not prejudice those non-Eurozone countries, particularly in terms of access to the single market. At its very core, the European Union was formed as a single market, not a single currency. And we need to preserve that fair access to the single market for all. And again, this isn't just about the UK. Obviously, there's 9 other countries outside the Eurozone within the European Union. And we need to ensure that there's a level playing field. And again, people say, well, surely it's not really a problem. But actually, we had a situation over the summer with the Greek bailout when the UK nearly became liable for the Greek bailout due to decisions that Eurozone countries were taken. And of course, the UK wasn't involved in that decision-making process, not being a Eurozone member. You can imagine what a gift that would be to the UK press. Loss of sovereignty to the European Union, UK bailing out Greece and having no say in the process. So we need to ensure that UK and other non-Eurozone countries are not prejudiced by decisions that we have no part in by Eurozone countries. Then we come on to welfare, which, as everyone knows, is the most delicate issue in both the European Union and in the UK itself. And the question I'm asked here most often is, why can't you just reform your own system in the UK? You say your system's generous, why can't you just crack down on abuse, and why are you making this a European issue? And the answer to that is that we have made significant changes to the UK welfare and benefit system over the last few years. We've clamped down on the benefits abuse, and we now have a much, much stronger system. But we have gone as far as we can domestically. To make the further changes that we need for the system to work, we need agreement from the European Union. And this is the most important issue for your average UK citizen. This is one people feel really, really strongly about. And it's about fairness. It's about the fact that UK taxpayers pay in to a benefit system before they receive any benefits back. If you're coming from another European country, you don't need to do that necessarily. And the statistics show that 40% of EU migrants are claiming some sort of benefits in the UK. That's seen as a huge burden by UK taxpayers. And our system was simply not designed to cope with this number of migrants coming in and claiming off our welfare system. Similarly, the welfare system is acting as a draw for people to come to the UK from other places within the European Union, including countries like Latvia. That's not good for those countries who may be losing some of their brightest and most talented skilled workers moving to the UK, normally, in many cases, to do less skilled jobs than they would be doing in their home countries. So we need to address this pull factor. And when the principle of free movement in the European Union was agreed, nobody envisaged the massive movements of migration on the scale that we've seen and the speed at which they've taken place. It's distorting the market within the European Union. And so it is actually in the interests of countries other than the UK that we address that distortion. So I'm sure you'll have questions on the specific areas of reform that I'm happy to come back to. Just wanted to give you a snapshot, as I said, as to where things are in the UK. And the polls have changed recently, partly due to the number of challenges the European Union is facing. There was a YouGov poll completed just 2 weeks ago, 20th, 24th of November, and that came down completely equally. 41% of those asked said they wanted to remain in the European Union. 41% said they wanted to leave. 15% were undecided. So you can see it's a really divisive issue within the UK. The Prime Minister has been really clear that he wants to keep the UK in the European Union. The European Union brings huge benefits to the UK, and the UK brings huge benefits to the EU in terms of economic, prosperity, security, and many others. And the Prime Minister is confident that he can persuade the UK public to remain in the European Union if those reforms that I've outlined are carried out. So the polls suggest that if the reforms are carried out, the polls then change with about 50% of people voting to remain in the European Union and 23% wanting to leave. So it's a massive change with the reforms that the Prime Minister set out. So he really does need to achieve these reforms, including in the very difficult areas. As I said, welfare is that area where the Brits feel most strongly about. They see it as unfair, the current system, and as everybody knows, fairness matters a lot to British citizens. So, in summary, I'd say just 3 things. This has been and still is a negotiation. It's an ongoing process. It's not been a case of the UK coming with a list of demands. The UK has taken things as far as we can domestically, especially on welfare. We now need the European Union to help us, as the European Union has helped other member states with different issues over the years and shown flexibility. And please don't underestimate the importance of the welfare issue to the UK public. There have been suppositions that this is a negotiation tactic. Ask for something really tough on welfare and you'll get your other 3 areas. This is not a negotiation tactic. The British public need reform on welfare to be persuaded of the case of staying in the European Union. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. If I may immediately to ask you a question. You mentioned that Prime Minister already had a round of negotiations with member states. What is the outcome of this first round of negotiations? How many allies UK has on its proposals?
So, as the Prime Minister said here in Riga, I'm not going to give a running commentary on the negotiations and the details. So I'm afraid I couldn't tell you how many allies he's got on each particular area. But the letter from Donald Tusk is very clear that there's consensus emerging in 3 areas of reform, and the most delicate, tricky issue that remains is welfare. So that's where there's still more political discussion to be had in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you. And now I will turn the floor to Jan Bond, ex-ambassador in Latvia. So there are no ex-ambassadors. Ambassadors are forever. So you are still following the state of affairs in the Baltic states, and of course you are very deeply into British affairs. After Cameron's announcement of referendum, there was also another announcement about audit of EU-British relations and what is cost-benefit analysis, substance of it. But I would be very curious, has been another analysis, cost-benefit analysis done, how much it would cost to UK if UK leaves, and how much it will cost to the European Union. But of course, it doesn't exclude what you wanted to say, it's just on top of what you're going to say. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Janetta, and may I say what an enormous pleasure it is to be back in Riga this evening. I have forgotten most of the Latvian that I ever knew, but I can still say that man ir liels prieks būt šeit vēlreiz. And it's also very nice to see some familiar faces here, and including Sarah. I'd like to correct one thing, Janetta. There are former ambassadors in the British system, thank God, because otherwise I would not be able to speak my mind this evening, and I certainly plan to. I mean, it's a very good time to be holding this debate between the publication of Donald Tusk's letter yesterday and the European Council discussion next week, at which these British ideas are likely to get some close scrutiny from member states. And I think what I'll try and do is to say very briefly how I think we got to where we are, and then, like Sarah, to look, but perhaps in a slightly different way, at the areas that David Cameron identified for the negotiation. I mean, I think it's fair to say that Britain has always been conflicted about Europe and about its EU membership, or its EEC membership, from the very beginning. We renegotiated once in 1975, and managed to pass a referendum then. Margaret Thatcher was a great supporter of the European single market, but by far not a supporter of political union or monetary union. And John Major, in rather unparliamentary terms, described those who made his life so miserable during the ratification of the Maastricht Treaty in the early 1990s as the bastards. Unfortunately, quite a few of the same members of the Conservative Party who made his life so miserable then are still making David Cameron's life miserable now. He became leader of the Conservative Party 10 years ago, telling his party that he'd had to stop banging on about Europe. And here we are in 2015, and what is David Cameron doing? He is banging on about Europe. And that shows two things. First, it shows that the Conservative Party really is resistant to change. And secondly, it shows that David Cameron has lost control of the argument. How did we end up committed to an in-out referendum? I think it was because David Cameron thought that it was a useful way of buying off the Eurosceptic wing of the party. I don't think that when he made the Bloomberg speech, he had really thought about where this renegotiation might lead, or how he was going to win a referendum. So he dug a hole, and he then failed to pay attention to the first rule of politics, and he just kept digging. I think there are any number of European leaders who would have been able to tell him that winning a referendum on anything to do with the EU is extremely difficult. The issues involved are hard to explain, they're easy to distort, and people use referendums as an opportunity to give the government a kicking, not necessarily for anything to do with the substance of the question that is on the paper, but simply because the government has become unpopular. And that I think is a real problem that we now face. In terms of the dynamics of the negotiation with the rest of the EU, I think it's also clear that Herman Van Rompuy was onto something when he talked about the disadvantage of the UK negotiating with one hand on the handle of the exit door. The problem is that if you are leading another member state, the British are demanding concessions, and some of those concessions are likely to be politically difficult for you. But you have no guarantee that even after you've made those concessions, the British are going to vote to stay in. And can you then unpick them? Can you then reverse the process once the British have left the room? This is really starting down a very dangerous road, I think. So the best option for many European leaders is to dig their heels in and to see how much the British are in fact prepared to concede on the demands that they're making. And that leaves David Cameron trying to deliver contradictory messages to his different audiences. And if you read the speech that he made to Chatham House a few weeks ago, you can see this, because in one part of the speech he is saying that the EU is essential to our prosperity and our security. And that, I think, is directed at reassuring the rest of Europe that really he wants to stay in, and therefore they should help him because he's trying to keep the UK in. And in another part of the speech, he is saying, but I reserve the right to recommend that we leave the EU. And that is a sort of bone thrown to the Rottweilers of the Eurosceptic wing of the Conservative Party. I think that is both incoherent and irresponsible. It is not statesmanlike. Now, as Sarah said, we are now in a very different Europe from the Europe of January 2013, when the Bloomberg speech was delivered and when David Cameron first put forward the idea of a referendum. The timing now could hardly be worse. We are in the middle of real crises, whether it's Russia's occupation of parts of Ukraine, whether it's Syria, the refugee crisis, the economic crisis which affects not only Greece but many countries in Europe. And here comes David Cameron, like an attention-seeking child. The house is burning down and he's saying, I want my ice cream and I want it now. I simply think this is the most counterproductive moment to be making these sorts of demands. And what's interesting is that in the last few days I've seen evidence that even among countries that have traditionally been regarded as sympathetic to the sorts of economic agenda that David Cameron is putting forward, there is growing irritation with the tactics and the timing of this approach. The other thing that strikes me is that the renegotiation is creating some very unlikely pairings. So we have both President Obama and President Xi Jinping saying publicly that they want the UK to stay in the EU. In fact, the only country that seems to be enthusiastic about the UK leaving is Russia. And RT is always happy to give a platform to members of UKIP demanding that the UK leaves the EU. And to spread all sorts of conspiracy theories about the supposed evils of the European Union. That tells me something, at least, about whether Brexit would be good for the UK and good for the EU. Now, since I now represent the Centre for European Reform, I am not going to say that the EU is a perfect organisation or that it is incapable of being improved further. There are certainly things that it can do better. And so, laying aside the questions of the tactics of holding the referendum, I just want quickly to look at these four areas of his reform package and ask whether they make sense. I think he's put on the table two sensible ideas, one thing that's worth thinking about, one thing that is a pointless gesture, and one thing that is positively dangerous. The two sensible ideas. First of all, competitiveness. And again, as Sarah said, I think this is the area that's probably the closest to consensus. The Commission's already doing a lot in this area, but there's always scope to do more, and if the British can claim credit for that, well, so much the better. It may help with the dynamics of the referendum. I think that what the British will have to take care of is that they don't make it sound as though this is not an agenda for better regulation, but an agenda for no regulation. Because there are a lot of countries in Europe who feel that you have to set minimum standards, and it sometimes sounds as though the British view is just get rid of all the standards, let the free market operate red in tooth and claw, and we'll see what happens at the end of it. And for a lot of people who have lived through the 2008-2009 financial crisis, they think it's that kind of irresponsible deregulation that got us into the mess then. The second thing that I think is sensible is giving national parliaments a greater voice in EU decision-making. But I would like to challenge slightly the point on the use of yellow cards. I mean, it is true that there are things that could be done to make it easier in terms of extending the period of time that parliaments have to consider EU legislation and so on. But if you look at the operation of scrutiny within the British Parliament, it is spectacularly ineffective. And if David Cameron wants to give the British Parliament a more effective voice in EU decision-making, he could do a lot worse than simply copying the examples of countries like Denmark and Sweden, which actually give their parliaments a much stronger role in mandating the positions that the government takes in EU negotiations. So there are some things that actually could be fixed domestically there. The thing that's worth thinking about is this question of the relationship between countries that are in the Eurozone and countries that are outside the Eurozone. I think there is a potential issue about the interests of those who are outside the Eurozone being affected by decisions that are taken inside the Eurozone. And while there are certainly some countries in the Eurozone that think that all that David Cameron is looking for is another veto for the City of London over any financial regulations that are drawn up within the Eurozone context, I do actually think that this is something that goes further than that. And I think it's something which is, that in a way the UK itself is grappling with in the Scottish context of how you make sure that decisions that are taken in a central body do not have unintended consequences in the periphery. So I think there is a real issue there, and it's worth looking at how we can deal with that. The pointless gesture is ever closer union. And I'm sorry that you perpetrated what I consider to be a fallacy of saying that the European Court of Justice is citing the provision on ever closer union in a way that justifies what the British government is saying. Because actually, what the Court of Justice has done is to use the principle of, or rather to use the second half of the preambular article on ever closer union to justify more transparency for European people of EU decision making, which is actually, I would have said, rather a good thing and something which the British ought to support. But in any case, the treaty refers to ever closer union between the peoples of Europe. It is not de facto or de jure a call for a political union or any other kind of union that the British government might find objectionable, and it has been watered down by this Council Declaration of 2014. The last thing, and the really dangerous thing, I think, is the proposal on EU migrants and their in-work benefits. I mean, this strikes at the basic principles of the single market, that you have free movement of goods, services, capital, and labour without discrimination. And it's addressing an invented problem. EU migrants already collect benefits at a much lower rate than UK citizens. And it panders to the prejudice that people come to the UK for our welfare benefits. They don't. By and large, they come to work, and their participation in the labour force is much higher than the participation of native British citizens. The 43% figure that the Prime Minister used in his Chatham House speech, I think it was, has been extensively criticised by statisticians who say you cannot derive this figure from the published data. Now, the government was supposed to stop using figures that it couldn't substantiate with professional statisticians, but this seems to be a very peculiar figure. And one of the figures that I have seen is that only 1.6% of the tax credit bill is actually being paid to EU citizens working in the UK. So we are looking at undermining a fundamental principle of the EU for the sake of 1.6% of the tax credit bill, which in itself is not a very enormous part of the overall national budget. The last thing that I want to say is to agree with Sarah that this is the most politically salient part of David Cameron's proposals, and that is the biggest problem. And it's why I'm becoming increasingly pessimistic about the chances of the UK actually staying in the EU. This is the only part of the package that most voters care about, and it is the most problematic part of the package for the other 27 member states and for the Court of Justice. Anything which tries to enshrine discrimination between citizens of different EU member states will be struck down by the Court of Justice. They have shown that repeatedly. You could just about get away with it for out-of-work benefits, because the court has taken a fairly sensible but narrow interpretation that the free movement of labour does not include the free movement of people who have no intention of working. But the moment you get onto in-work benefits, there is a pile of case law that shows that discrimination will fail. So I think we're in a very sticky position there. I guess I need to answer your question on alternative models, and I will try and do that very quickly. I'll give a plug for the Centre for European Reform. We have done quite a lot of work. My colleagues who work on the economic side have done quite a lot of work on that. Essentially, there are a variety of different models. There is the Norway model, or the European Economic Area. And that essentially would involve the UK in having continued access to the single market, but accepting pretty much automatically all of the rules of the single market, except in areas where the UK chose not to participate in the single market at all. It gives us no voice, and I cannot see how it amounts to a recovery of sovereignty. We would actually have less regulatory sovereignty than we have now. There is the Swiss model, which means that you negotiate case by case in every area of the operation of the single market, a bilateral agreement. The Commission has made pretty clear that it has no interest in doing this ever again with any other country. It is simply too cumbersome. And when the Swiss do try to exercise their national sovereignty, for example, when they held a referendum on limiting migration from the EU, the response of the EU is to threaten to cut them out of large areas of the single market. Again, I question whether this is actually increasing the UK's sovereignty. Third model is the customs union model, the Turkish model. That would certainly give us more regulatory sovereignty in some ways, but it would also, as we're seeing now with Turkey and the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, mean that the UK would not be able automatically to benefit from free trade agreements negotiated by the EU. So there are some potential benefits to sovereignty, but also some losses in terms of what you can, as it were, pull out of the EU central pot. And the last model, which is one which is much favoured by the most extreme Eurosceptics, is that we just go our own way. We pretend that we are China, we are a member of the World Trade Organization, we will negotiate everything bilaterally with everybody else. Well, that's fine if you are the second largest economy in the world and you have 1.2 billion people who are getting significantly richer every year. I question whether it is a workable model for a country of 70 million people which has not had its own trade negotiators for the last 20 or 30 years. But we can give it a try. Personally, I will not be, or at least I shall be hoping not to give it a try, and I'd better start brushing up my Latvian or finding 300,000 euros to buy myself residency.
We can arrange.
Thank you, Jan, for a different perspective and also putting forward those four models, which is really worth discussing. Are they discussed in UK?
The answer is they have not been very much discussed in the UK, and there's an interesting shift in tactics on the Eurosceptic side. For a while, the Eurosceptics were very keen on the Norway model. Then there was a sort of discussion in the press about whether the Norway model really worked, after which several of the Eurosceptics who had previously promoted it denied that they had ever promoted it. And now what they seem to be trying to do is to get the British people to vote to leave the EU, and only then to start to discuss what the alternatives might be. And of course, once the door is closed, there is no very easy way back through it other than by applying again to become a new member and having to accept all of the acquis.
Thank you. I would like just to recall some facts from not so very distant history, because when the European Union was debated at the first time, constitutions, then constitutional treaty, then reform treaty and Lisbon treaty, the Baltic states particularly, but also other Central and Eastern European countries, were wondering how it comes that there is a European Union treaty without a clause of leaving the European Union. And for the Baltic states, it was one of comparisons with the Soviet Union, that even in the Soviet constitution there was a clause to leave, but not in the European Union. And then one of the arguments against this clause was that the European Union is so rational that nobody even will dare to leave the European Union. So, but as a matter of principle, so to pay some compliment to the Baltic states and Poland, this clause was included. It just happens that, yeah, probably this clause will be actually used at one point, but I hope that not. Now I would like to turn the floor to Artis Lenč, who is a member of Latvian Parliament, and since Sarah and Jan already mentioned that one of Cameron's proposals is related to more power and role to national parliaments, I would like to ask you, Artis, do you really feel that Latvian Parliament doesn't have a say in EU affairs?
Hasn't?
Yeah, hasn't?
No.
Okay.
Well, Well, I'm trying to recover from what the former ambassador to Latvia was saying, and I just really can agree with you. I think everybody agrees with you, and we've always have said it that this is the worst time to have a referendum, and you mentioned why. Russia, the millions of refugees and everything else, and you have yesterday the president of the European Parliament saying that the EU can unravel. You know, this is the first time I've heard of such a high person in such a high position say something like that. So the danger of disintegration is bad, because countries are setting up borders around each other, but not the outer border, and the outer border is the one that matters. But that's just a few remarks about that. But at the four models, models, that's right, that you mentioned, let me touch upon those. I will leave to Mr. Stiprace to see how far we have gone in the technical details of the 4 areas that the British are negotiating with us, you know. But let me begin first by saying that in Latvia we have the same system as in Denmark and Sweden. We have full scrutiny. It's not just Denmark, and I'm sitting on the European Affairs Committee, and before well, everybody knows this, but I'll say it again, before a minister or a state secretary or the experts can go to Brussels, they have to go through us, and we speak in the name of the Parliament, the European Affairs Committee. That's what we can do that. And since we have a coalition, we more or less, maybe we can amend 1 or 2 things, but we always have a good dialogue and we know what's going on. So there is really, well, it's a system that is working, because let me remind you, actually all the work begins in Brussels with our ambassador to the European Union, you know, the co-reppers, the heads of our delegations there. They do the hard work. They report to us, to the government. The government goes back. I can explain this by positions. Position 1, position 2, position 3. One proposal comes in Brussels, done by our head of delegation and by the other heads of delegations. Then the position goes back after the government in Latvia, the different ministries have looked at it, goes back to the councils, and it always goes through us in the European affairs. So we can't really complain. I think that we have full insight and we have even power to change things, except that we have a coalition and we don't do that very often. So I think I agree with Mr. Bond that Britain can improve its domestic scrutiny of the Parliament, and then you would be much more at home, you know. You would feel that you are owner of the process and not just the government. It would be also the Parliament. That's one thing about that, and I think we did a favor for Great Britain in the Latvian presidency when we moved ahead this business about the colored cards, you know. Myself, I have to confess, I'm not really that much interested in them. You need really a consultant. Our consultants, we have now many consultants thanks to the EU presidency who can really, you know, go through the whole thing of every position that every decision, every directive or regulation, is it in line with subsidiarity or if it isn't, you know. But we have this and we move forward and we have no objections to it. So I think that probably is going forward, and I think we have no argument at. We have no argument whatsoever with competitiveness. We've always pushed that. A small country must be competitive as Latvia, and we need a big market as the European Union, otherwise we're lost. So we have no arguments about that. And I can remind you that about regulation that's overdone. Let me remind you that the new Commission has dropped almost over 70 directives and regulations that have been stuck in the system somehow because there's no need for them. Because Dombrovskis, when he was in Riga just about a month ago, said that, look, the EU will not do the things that the national governments can do. There's no need for that, or even for local governments, you know, do it. We'll just drop them. We'll do what is best for the EU in a globalized situation. And the national states do best for what they can do, you know. So there's really no argument about that. That in the new Commission there's full understanding of that. And about that's the 2 models. We've done that, okay. The bad for the Eurozone inside and outside. Well, yes, we can talk about that too. We're glad we're in the Eurozone. Can you imagine if Latvia was not in the Eurozone? I mean, what would happen to the banking system, the Latvian currency, if we did not have the euro during the crisis and everything else. And I think that that's all I will say about this. Maybe Mr. Stiprace can say something more about that. But the fact that we've lost so much money when the banks have gone down, and now we have a very strong banking union in the European Union. And I know there's some problems about the guarantee funds, but nevertheless, people in Latvia now are actually, if I tell them, listen, you'll never lose money again, thanks to the European Union, because it's done on a wider basis than just Latvia, you know, you'll always have your 100,000 euros, which you're sitting on, you know, like we're all sitting 100,000 euros, and now we're not going to lose it, you know. That's great news. That is really great news. I would like to ask you if people in Great Britain understand that, you know, if the ordinary person in the street who also has 100,000 euros in the bank knows that he will never lose it, and then the people, the taxpayers in Great Britain will never have to fork out to save banks again, as you did with the banks in Great Britain. What was the famous bank that went under?
Northern Rock.
Yeah, Northern Rock and so on. So, yeah. So, okay, and I think the Irish would agree with me also, you know, look at the catastrophe. You need a banking union, you need something like in America. The banking union isn't simply a copy of what America has, actually. So we're not very original, but it's worked in America, and I hope it works here. So ever closer union. You took the words out of my mouth, so I won't comment that anymore. It's between peoples, and then it brings me right to the next point. Welfare. Yes, I understand. This is the sticking point, and I can agree with the British ambassador, and we've talked also about this previously, that it should not be abused. We don't like the system to be abused in Latvia either, but there's one thing that we have to stick to, and that is the free movement of people, right? And we will stick on that,
yeah.
Okay? And because it's a huge benefit, not just for us, but for everybody, for the economy. At least 500 million people, it's not 1.2 billion, but it's still a lot. And we have a huge say in the world economy, because we are together, 500 million people. And I'm just afraid, I just came back from America, I'm a bit of a jet lag, you know, but we took up a meeting with the senators and the congressmen and the think tanks, and people really didn't want to talk about it because it's, well, you know, it's, we're in a messy political situation ourselves, you know, and all that. But it was made clear that if the European Union does sign the free trade agreement with America, Britain cannot expect any exemptions. You're out. But of course, that would be the bad news. The good news is maybe there will be no free trade agreement with America, and then puts Britain in a better position. But that is not something that is really, you know, positive, is it? Because if you're now going to have a Pacific free trade agreement between America and Asia, where does that put Europe? Okay? Well, that might not pass through Congress. Okay? Okay, good news again, but you know, I'm not sure. Maybe it can be passed through Congress. But I'll end with the statement that what the Americans really impressed upon us, you know, was that where can America turn to for friends and allies? It's only Europe, democracies. And if and Europe, where can they turn to? China, you know, Russia? It's America. And I think that gives good cause for the TTIP to succeed, you know. And I think that if Britain leaves this huge system, the 21st century, for things that, not for us, Latvians are sometimes very hard to understand, because I'm old enough to remember the Second World War. I was very directly affected by it. And think that we can return to the 1930s, you know, it's a nightmare, a complete nightmare. So I really hope that you vote yes in the referendum and you stay in the European Union.
Thank you. Now I would like to turn the floor to Edward. So the question which I wanted to ask you was already asked by Attis. So what is Latvia's stance on negotiations on the UK's proposals? So of course I don't want you to reveal all details of negotiation process, but as a democratic country we would like to know where do we stand.
Okay, probably I'm going to disappoint you, because I'm here rather in the expert capacity as a former ambassador to United Kingdom and not in my current position, because my responsibilities within the foreign ministry encompass everything except for EU institutional issues or relations with United Kingdom. So I'm not. So if my intervention does reflect some parts of our official position, this is absolutely unintentional.
This is a British understatement.
Well-trained diplomat.
Yes, I would say first and foremost, exactly because as a former ambassador to the United Kingdom, I can afford being quite frank. I must say first and foremost, I fully share what Ian explained as some kind of the undercurrents which were behind the decision of the Conservative government to call for the referendum on UK's membership in the Union. And of course, I was there in that Bloomberg room, yes, in 2013. And frankly speaking, it didn't come as something unexpected. No. We followed, the whole of the European diplomatic community down there in London, some colleagues from non-EU countries. We followed very closely all political developments, both before elections of May 2010 and after that, and we knew about those pledges that David Cameron made during his election as the party leader, actually, to review relations with the European Union. I would say that by itself, this idea is not bad. And actually, speaking of the one integral part of this process, which is the review of EU competences, I think is extremely beneficial to everybody, not just to Britain, but to the rest of the Union as well. And I can say that probably we also learned quite a lot from that exercise. This is probably, to date, the most complete study of this division of competences between a particular member state and the Union. So, there are bright parts to this as well. But when I'm going to describe the process in general, and this is purely personal impression, which is, this I'm not reflecting any official position, is that unfortunately Britain is sleepwalking towards the exit. And exactly because of those reasons that Ian described, and this is that unfortunately most of referendums that do happen across the world, vote is almost never on the question asked. And they are influenced by various completely unrelated reasons. So this is something where I see enormous risk. Enormous risk in the fact that current government will have to reverse overall extremely skeptical public opinion about the European Union, European integration, that unfortunately large part of the Conservative Party nurtured and supported over previous decades. So now they have to do a kind of the volte-face and start to defend the cause that they were extremely critical about before. This is extremely... in countries like Russia, you can do that. If you follow the recent speech of Mr. Putin to the parliament, he didn't mention Ukraine at all, which was the main concern the year before. Sometimes you can do that, but probably not in mature democracies. Another problem is that part of the debate is based on misgivings about Europe, European institutions, European integration, which is based on kind of the misperceptions. And if I may mention just probably two major areas. One is complete mix-up of European institutions, various European institutions, in a public debate, a non-professional public debate. I mean, when you speak to lay people, which is probably, I don't know, intentionally or unintentionally, of course, these kind of misperceptions are disseminated by the British media. Like, for example, I would say, as a rule, mixing up Council of Europe and the European Union. Yeah. Making false attributions of statements, rulings, whatsoever. Mixing up European Court of Human Rights with the European Court of Justice. And similar other things. So, I mean, one of those examples is, for example, the ruling of the European Court of Human Rights on the vote of prisoners, of prison inmates, right of vote, which is attributed by the media and Eurosceptics to the European Union, and things like that. And unfortunately, I must admit that I wouldn't blame the current government. I mean, all the previous governments in the United Kingdom, they didn't invest enough in trying to dispel this kind of misinterpretations and misperceptions and things like that. So now they have to catch up with this and to do something in those months remaining before the referendum. Another thing is speaking particularly about the most contentious issue in those four areas proposed for reform, and this is on free movement of labor and labor-related migration. Again, if you look to what, I mean, this is the complete mix-up of the EU internal migration and the external migration. If you follow the British press, which I did quite carefully for 4 years, which I was posted in London, you would find that, for example, they would put some cases in of outrageous misuse of the social system, social support system in the United Kingdom, like, for example, a family actually claiming housing benefits for the 6-bedroom apartment in Chelsea area, and being paid by the local council in full. A family coming from Ethiopia, for example. And then, as the kind of the conclusion to that article, you would have claim that all of those labor migrants, they are misusing British system, whether this illustration is coming from the completely different area, and things like that, which were building this kind of the quite negative attitude. Then coming to 4 reform areas. Again, the first 2, they shouldn't present any problem, and most probably they wouldn't. we may have a more nuanced position on this. And thing is that one, of course, it would be extremely unfair to allow members within the countries within the Eurozone take decisions which would have effect on the rest of the Union without properly consulting the rest of the Union. At the same time, equally unfair would be that countries which are outside the Eurozone would have any possibility to veto or stop whatever decisions that the Eurozone countries would find as necessary to carry on, some actions to preserve the Eurozone, to ensure that it's stable and prosperous. So this is something which would require a very thorough discussion on this, and finding this, should I say, a very, very fine balance between rights and obligations of both parts, within and outside the Eurozone. On the last one, I would say in principle it shouldn't be a problem at all if we do adjust, welfare systems of one or another country. The problem is that some of those proposals, if we want to implement them in full, would require treaty changes, which in current, should I say, political environment, with all external pressures, migration debate, terrorism, we are still in the aftermath of one of the most severest financial crises, both within the Eurozone and in the Union as in general. I would find it extremely unlikely that we would agree to treaty changes. Moreover, because that would trigger also ratification processes in all 28 member states, and most probably a number of referendums. I would say, if not in all member states, that in a large part of the member states, the outcome of which is, I would say, is rather unpredictable. Frankly speaking, I would hear from some of our Dutch colleagues that they would see this as a nightmare scenario, taking into account their previous vote. The same for Irish, French. Yeah, exactly. I would find this almost mission impossible. At the same time, any deal which would fall on free movement of persons, which would fall short of treaty changes, would be most probably then challenged in the European Court of Justice. And I would say with a certain probability would be overturned by the court. So we would be back to the square one. Probably not in a year's time, in 2 and 3 years' time, because the court proceedings are rather long, which may help probably to pass the referendum, but then what's the point of it? So this is something that we should take into account. And then, of course, if we speak about actually making any treaty changes to one of the fundamental freedoms, unfortunately that might trigger a wider debate on the rest of the package, because we take all 4 freedoms as a package. And where that debate may lead is rather unpredictable, and I can say again on a personal note, I'm afraid to look that far. I'm frankly afraid. And then, of course, speaking about the future for the United Kingdom, outside the Union, then my question would be, what United Kingdom? Because most probably this is going to affect debate in Scotland on Scottish independence. I mean, there are already voices amongst these, politicians in Scotland who openly said that they would trigger the rerun of independence referendum based on new circumstances. And the second one, this is what kind of impact this may have on the Good Friday Agreement in the Northern Ireland, on the implementation of Good Friday Agreement. I'm afraid this is something which is not probably properly calculated by all parties involved. So, with this extremely optimistic picture, I would like to end now.
Thank you, Edward, very much. Indeed, very many points, and I think several of them were already debated, I think, in UK and in Latvia as well. So I think that indeed, even if Brexit is not the main headline in our media, still it's a very important debate for Latvian European perspective as well. So because it includes a lot of relevant issues for us as a free movement of people, free movement of capital, as issues related to the role of public opinion in EU policy making and so on. But I think that now it's a moment again turn floor to Sarah and to reflect on some of views which were expressed before. Please, Sarah.
Thank you. Okay, briefly, I just wanted to pick up on some of the comments made on each of the 4 reform areas. So starting with competitiveness, as you heard, a broad degree of consensus. But as Ian rightly flagged up, this is not about no regulation. That's not what the UK is aiming at. It's looking at better regulation. And that's particularly for small and medium-sized businesses that at the moment can be, in some cases, put out of business by too much regulation and red tape, as we call it in the UK. So just to be clear, it's about better, more efficient, effective regulation, not no regulation. On national parliaments, again, yes, Latvia's system of scrutiny works very effectively, but the UK has concerns about the role of national parliaments. And this isn't just an issue that the UK is concerned about. In fact, I think it was first raised by our Dutch colleagues about how much of a say national parliaments have. So again, these aren't just issues that are important to the UK, they're important to other member states as well. In terms of economic governance and the Eurozone ins and outs, Atis talked about the importance of the banking union and the fact that the Eurozone has been good for Latvia and good for a number of other member states. Absolutely, the UK is not disagreeing with that in any way, shape or form. We're not saying that member states shouldn't join the Eurozone if they want to, and for many it is the right decision for them, but it's not the right decision for the UK. So rather than trying to prevent the effective operation of the Eurozone, we actually want the Eurozone to improve its own operation. We just need to make sure it doesn't discriminate against the Eurozone outs. On sovereignty and ever closer union, it's not about which case that the European Court of Justice has invoked that principle in, and whether they were right to, and it was something the UK thinks is a good thing or not. It's about the principle that the court has used the concept of ever closer union to make a decision. And so in future, that might be a decision that goes against what the UK sees as in our interests. And then on benefits, yes, of course, not everybody coming to the UK is claiming benefits, but you can argue about statistics till the cows come home. The government stands by its 40% figure in terms of migrants claiming in-work benefits in the UK. And that's the point. It's the way our system works that you can get a top-up. So you might earn a certain amount in Latvia doing a job, you do the same job in the UK, but your salary will be topped up to a certain level, depending on what it is. So that does create a pull factor if you can do the same job in the UK and earn more money than you can earn doing the same job in Latvia. And it's that pull factor that we need to address. And I was delighted to hear Edward say that he thinks that we should be able to come to agreement on welfare, but he's quite right to flag up the issue of treaty change, which is not something that we've talked about otherwise. And yes, we fully appreciate countries have concerns about treaty change, not least there are challenges facing the Union at the moment, and a full-blown round of treaty change would not be productive at the moment. But it's exactly because of judgments of the European Court of Justice on benefits that we would need this change on welfare to be enshrined in the treaties. But that doesn't, as I said, doesn't need to be opening the treaties, renegotiating the core principles. There have been lots of examples previously where treaty change has taken place without there needing to be referendums in any other member states. Could be an additional protocol to the treaties. The UK isn't stipulating what that will be, but that's being worked through at the moment as part of the negotiations as to what form treaty change could take, because we fully appreciate that referendums in all member states is not something that's going to be productive in terms of the overall outcome. Similarly, we're not disputing the principle of free movement of people. That's something we've heard very loud and clear from a number of member states as being an important core value of the Union. So we're not saying we don't agree with free movement of people. What we're saying is we need to address the benefit system in the UK so it doesn't act as a pull factor for people coming to the UK. And finally, the point that's been made about the referendum. It's people saying it's a risk. Referendums are used to hit the government. People don't necessarily vote on the question that's being asked. All that, of course, is true, but as the Prime Minister is very fond of reminding people, he's held 2 referendums since he's been Prime Minister of the UK, and he's won them both. One was on voting, sort of the domestic voting system within the UK. The one that everybody knows about is the Scottish referendum. Many people said that was a huge risk. There were plenty of naysayers saying it's the end of the United Kingdom. And it wasn't. He won. He won the Scottish referendum. And he is confident that if he gets the reforms that he needs on the European Union, he can win the campaign and convince the UK public to remain within the European Union. So I think that's about the only thing that we all agree on, all 4 of us, which is that we all would like the UK to remain in the European Union. Personally, I would like that, as well as it being the UK government position. So I'm sure that the European Union and the member states can be flexible to find a solution that means that the UK can remain within the European Union, as it has done when other member states have faced difficulties, and the Union's been flexible enough to help them find a solution.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it's time to turn the floor for questions to the audience, and we could take a few questions. Yeah, Carly. Please take a microphone. Yeah, here is another one.
Latvian Institute of National Affairs. Thank you very much for your excellent presentations. I was looking at the topic of the seminar, and I was wondering about the referendum, about the perspectives. But we mostly have been covering only one perspective, well, the Brexit perspective, the gloomy side of the perspective. I'm very happy that Sarah addressed the issue of how Prime Minister Cameron sees himself, how the referendum will be going. So my question is purely curious. It's maybe a bit more theoretical, maybe jumping a bit ahead of the things. But how do you think, and I think it goes not only to you, Sarah, but also to Jan, how do you think if the referendum goes positively, and we all hope it's going to be positive that Britain stays in the European Union, will there be a political momentum? What kind of British relations with the European Union can we expect? Can we actually, because of this political momentum, expect also some, I don't know, renegotiations of opt-outs or something like this? Or will it be the same British policy towards the European Union that we have been seeing for decades already? Thank you.
Maybe probably we should start with Jan and then Sarah.
Well, I think that's an excellent question. You have put your finger on another problem in a way. I mean, Sarah's quite right. David Cameron won the Scottish referendum, but he has lost Scotland. And 56 out of 59 parliamentary seats in Scotland are now held by the Scottish National Party. It achieved a majority in the general election in Scottish seats, which it had never even come close to doing before. And my worry is that actually, even if the referendum, from my perspective, as it were, is won, and the UK votes to stay in the EU, that actually that will not be the end of the debate at all. It will only be the beginning. And those who want us to leave the EU will have been galvanized by the referendum campaign, and they will keep coming back for more. And I think that is a real worry based on the experience in Scotland. I feel much less certain that by the end of my life I will still be living in the United Kingdom than I did before the announcement of a referendum in Scotland. And I'm worried that the same is going to apply to the EU referendum.
Thanks. In terms of our relationships with the European Union, I think it would be a brave British Prime Minister that renegotiated our relationship and then came back with lots more demands after the renegotiation. So certainly as far as I'm aware, there are no plans to secure the negotiation that's currently on the table and then come back and say, oh, and by the way, we'd like this, this, this and this. Of course, it's not going to completely end a debate within the UK about our relationship with the European Union, but I don't think any member state within the European Union doesn't still have an ongoing debate about their relationship with the European Union. But what it will do is draw a lot of the poison, if you like, from the debate. People cannot then say they haven't had this say. And that's exactly the case for Scotland. The Prime Minister is able to turn around very clearly when people say whatever and say, well, you've had your say, the Scottish people have voted, and this is a clear decision. So actually having a clear decision is going to be more positive for the UK than this position we're in at the moment, with this very poisonous atmosphere, both from the political parties and the British press and the British public, in terms of constantly coming back to what's our relationship with the European Union.
Thank you.
Ladies ambassador, and I'm still a little depressed because less than a week ago the Danes voted no to a referendum. And this was about Euro, and the Danish government thought, well, Danes will of course say that we should continue being part of the Europol and change our opt-out rule here to a different position where we have the chance to have actually the British model. But as has been said, referendum is a very tricky and dangerous instrument, and I think that we would like to avoid as many referendum as possible in Denmark at least. So the point about treaty changes, of course, also applies very much to Denmark. One little comment to some of the issues on the social benefits. Here, I think my government would like to support to a certain extent the British points of views and have come up with at least one idea is on child benefits, which is something that is discussed quite a lot in Denmark, where you could try to introduce an indexation of the benefits, in the sense that if you come from Romania to Denmark, then you should not have child benefits with the children being in Romania, which will be similar to the salary that you will actually get in Romania. So it would say you can get child benefits, but according to what it would be in Romania. That's the idea about indexation. But that could perhaps be one way forward. It would probably not require any treaty changes. One little last comment would be on the Latvian position. One thing that I didn't hear so much, which I would have expected to hear, is that simply also a British exit would be so terrible also in terms of wider security. I mean, it was not being an exit of NATO, of course, but But I just want to hear how that regarded also as an important issue. Thank you. Thank you for good presentations.
Thank you, Hans. So probably others could respond to
Security.
Well, you all know what happened to the Baltic states during the Second World War, when Europe was fragmented, nationalistic, fighting each other, and this is our worst nightmare. And when we wrote our first security concept or strategy, we said we had a terrific formula to secure the irreversibility of restored independence. It's a fantastic formula. And that meant joining the European Union and NATO, both. And if the European Union fragments, as I said, and Great Britain is very pivotal in the European Union for security, then what I told at a COSAC conference in Denmark, your countries, about 1.5 years ago, to Sir William Cash, who is one of the skeptics in the British Parliament in our meetings, said Britain will diminish itself and it'll diminish the European Union. And I'll just add another thing. NATO is not enough because NATO is just the military, You need everything else. And did I hear you right? You're not going to be in the Europol? That's impossible. Well, this is against our national interests. You just voted against, common sense. But let me say that when we look, Washington is like the new Rome, right? Actually, if you look at the buildings, it is Rome. It's based on the buildings in Rome. The capital was built before the Civil War, and they didn't finish it, but they kept on building the capital even during the American Civil War. And it's based on the Roman architecture. Anyway, America has to deal with 200 countries in the world. What is Latvia? 2 million people. But we were well received, and the main reason was we got our act together. We are in the European Union, and we are in NATO. And furthermore, now we are a frontline state with Russia. So that gives us very good access to American policymakers and parties and senators. Britain has a huge embassy in Washington. Wow. We drove past us. It took us some time to get past,
That's the traffic jams often.
Yeah, but Sunday. and I just wonder, what Obama said, that if you will have the access of, only 60 million people, in the future, don't the British public understand that? If I tell the Latvian public what I'm telling you, they understand immediately. It's visceral. Oh, it's in the backbone. We did the right thing. We need a strong protector. That's America. And we got everything we wanted.
Exactly what was mentioned. In terms of hard security, I must say that presence or absence of United Kingdom in EU is probably not that crucial. Still there is NATO, but we are speaking about the soft power of the European Union, and this is something which is probably as equal important, especially when we are building up our relations with more or less sympathetic countries in the rest of the world, including our immediate neighborhood. So this is something with exit of UK, we might lose, amongst other things, a voice of reason on many issues, which was closely allied not only to Latvia or Baltic states, but to the rest of the Nordic Baltic region. I think that would be enormous blow to our ability to influence overall EU policies in many areas, including external trade. For obvious reasons. We are part of probably the most liberal trade regimes in the world. We want to keep this kind of the mercantile approach. Yes, I mean, frankly speaking, our relations with Russia as a reaction to comparatively recent developments in Crimea, Ukraine, now Syria, and so we are probably the most closely aligned countries, I mean Nordics, Baltics and UK on those issues within the Union, when we have to take decisions on sanctions against aggressor and things like that. So I would say inevitably it will have impact on our ability to project our interests. We would lose one of the strongest of our allies. Amongst other things, within the European Union, the European Common Security and Defence Policy, United Kingdom for a number of years was a framework nation for this UK Nordic Baltic battle group. I mean, if UK is out, then we need to look for another kind of this backbone of this battle group, one major nation which could keep together smaller units from the rest of the region.
Thank you, Edward. I think with the rights of moderator of this discussion and looking at the watch, I have to wrap up the session. And I think that there was one key word of the discussion which was mentioned by all participants, even not in a very explicit way. And what we are discussing today, it's actually democracy. And democracy is not something what is given forever, but democracy is a process. And of course, UK is now exercising the right of democracy. Democracy is exercised by people who are going to vote in referendum. It's also exercise of democracy which is done by political parties, political leaders. And whatever we can wish and also to pass as the message to UK is really to succeed in this exercise, because UK in the European Union is the only solution and the only end result we which would like to see, because as Edwards also mentioned, Europe is not only about directives, it's not only about institutions and courts, it's very much about people integrating together after the Second World War, and I think that our destiny has to bring us also to the bright future. I would like to end on this positive note and invite everybody to thank panelists and also to have a glass of wine and coffee in the lobby. So thank you very much.